Hello, I'm Helen Goddard. I'm the president of the Institute of Sound and Communication Engineers, and I'm here today with Neil Vos.
Hello.
We're very lucky to be at the Rose Shore Experience Centre in London, fortuitously overlooking the Great Fire of London monument, because today we were talking about voice alarm, which is part of a fire alarm system. And so, Neil, what are we going to be talking about today?
What we're going to talk about is that the ISCVE has undertaken a survey internationally to look at the take-up of voice alarm almost globally, looking primarily at two aspects. One, the type of premises in which voice alarm is currently being installed in each territory, and secondly, about the persons that are involved in the installation and operation of those voice alarm systems. The UK prides itself on having world-leading standards in fire protection, leading to a safe environment for everyone living and working in our country. And as we travel the world, we find that many of the standards that apply in these countries are based on the original British standards, UK standards. And this adoption of the UK standards is very welcome for us as an industry. And the implication is that the people that are working from the UK or internationally are experts in the standards because they are originally their standards. But as we travel internationally, we meet people working in different territories. We find that the experience of the application of voice alarm and the standards differs greatly from country to country. And it's not altogether clear, having spoken to people around the world, that the UK is really leading the way actually in the application of the standards and voice alarm as an industry.
Okay, well, I can certainly relate to that. And you and I have both been working in the voice alarm industry for several decades, probably far too many to mention. So the Institute decided to take a bit of action through your lobbying committee, of which you're the chair, to try and to collect some data and maybe think about this a little bit more scientifically. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so we put together an online questionnaire, and we got around 100 people from about 20 different countries to answer questions that were related to the how and the where of the voice alarm industry in their particular country and in their experience. And so that led us to a nice body of data with some interesting views from different people. And in that, we've then compared people's experience from their particular territory, contrasted to our own UK experience.
So, 100 respondents, that's pretty impressive, and a lot of data that you've gathered. So I guess we should have a look and go through some of that. So Neil, could you tell us where voice alarm is currently installed within the UK?
Surprisingly, there's no actual legislation to require voice alarm to be installed anywhere in the UK. In line with most fire regulations in the UK, the guidance is that the system should be appropriate. There's no, and that's therefore open to interpretation. Originally, in London, one of the drivers of the voice alarm standards was the GLC's Section 20, which did require buildings of 6 stories or more to have a secure public address system before the term voice alarm was installed. But since the GLC is long defunct, that regulation is also long defunct. And we find even in London, there's pressure on developers, or pressure applied by developers, to remove voice alarm where it's adding cost that they don't wish to incur.
Well, talking about the GLC, I'm sure you were still in education, as was I. And we've been doing this a very long time. So that's quite almost frightening that it's taken such a back seat. So how does this compare with other countries that have responded to our survey?
Well, we did a sort of take up of one of the questions we asked was, what did our respondents think of the take up in the UK? And I think around 40% of UK respondents felt that the take up was very poor. We have take up, we have voice alarm, for example, in underground railway stations, in most multi-storey office blocks and so on. But there's a large area that we don't have, a large number of projects we don't get involved in. For example, if you look at somewhere like Germany, if you have a supermarket of 1,500 square metres, a nice simple metric, then you should have a voice alarm. And we see this in many countries, that there are more clear-cut regulations as to where a voice alarm should be installed.
So you've mentioned specifically Germany. Is there anything further afield that you could speak about?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you head further afield, if you go into Turkey, you have multi-use residential office buildings would all be required to have a voice alarm. If you go to the Middle East, for example, in the United Arab Emirates, in Dubai, if you have a 6-story building or 10-story building, again, whether it's whatever use it is, including residential, there'll be a method of communicating via voice, at least into the common areas of every building.
So now you've spoken then about Turkey and Dubai. Are there any other cases that you found that were of particular interest?
Yeah, one of the more interesting stories was talking to people working in Italy, in that voice alarm has a very high take up there. And one of the reasons why is because they introduced a fire risk assessment form wherein the licensing person, who was going to hold the license, had to actually specifically say that they'd considered whether to include a voice alarm, and they themselves had decided it didn't need one, and they had to sign to that effect, which instantly meant that voice alarm take up in the country increased dramatically.
So what you're telling us really is that despite the fact that the UK is leading the charge in terms of the technical development of the standards and the products, the uptake isn't really the same as at international level.
I would say that many of our respondents said the uptake was very low in comparison to the percentages that the other countries came back with as to what they thought the take-up was. And so, if you get, again, looking at the Middle East and Far East, take-up is coming much higher. Nordic countries, Scandinavia, again, voice alarm is mandated into really quite small buildings that have public occupation. So, yeah, I think we're way behind the curve.
So having listened to what you've just said, Neil, it would seem that the real reason for the lack of uptake in the UK that our members have responded on is simply that there is no mandatory or regulatory requirement to have a voice alarm system.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much the case. So obviously, with every developer has an eye to cost, and if there's no mandatory requirement, they're keen to avoid it. I mean, it does seem surprising that when you look at high-level residential buildings where it is mandated elsewhere in the world, that we don't have anything mandated here that enables us to communicate on for mass evacuation into the common areas of multi-storey residential and mixed-use buildings.
That was obviously one part of your study. There was obviously a second part too, which was to look at the implementation of voice alarm systems in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, as well as the where, we were looking at the who. So, where we do have mandatory control is to have a voice alarm product, then the manufacturer has to put that product through testing by a certified independent laboratory. So to that extent, we have some control. But then who actually deals with that product once it's been manufactured is much more loosely controlled or barely controlled at all. The standards talk about having a competent person, but there's no definition of what a competent person is. And this, again, contrasts badly with international take-up, international implementation. Yeah,
so could you put that into some broader context?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some other cases, if you were in Germany, for example, before you could even begin to design a voice alarm system, you would need to have actually had an exam. It was about 120 questions to prove your competence in actually designing the system. And then you become a licensed system designer, and then you can do that. If you look at Denmark, and there are other countries around there with a similar idea, individuals are licensed as commissioning engineers. So, for example, any electrical company, for example, might be able to install a voice alarm system, but at the end they have to have a personally qualified commissioning engineer to come along and actually set the system to work. And then each voice alarm system is independently tested by a person from the fire authority who does bring professional testing equipment to ensure that the system is working as it should. And although we have some of that independent testing in the UK, only really on the very largest systems, most of the others would go through on a nod from the competent person whose competence, unfortunately, is ill-defined. And we just have to be a little bit careful also to separate between a company and the personal qualification, because a company sometimes might hold a qualification, but really that's down to the people that work for that company. And as we all know, staff come and go from one company to another on a pretty regular basis. So it seems sensible that the person is part of that responsibility.
So that's the UK situation. Is that at variance with other countries?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, with the Germany and Denmark and many other countries, in the UAE, again, for example, you would have to have, if you were importing a voice alarm system, you would have to show the licensing authority that you have a proper connection to the manufacturer, that you are trained, that you have a number of engineers, that you have after-sales service and so on in place. Again, it's just part of a regulatory package which we're very reluctant to take on here in the UK.
So, Neil, there was a fairly significant input into the ISCVE survey from the UK membership. Were there any particular feedback that we could gain from them as to how they regard the implementation of voice alarm in the UK?
Yeah, well, other than the initial sort of poor take-up figure that we mentioned earlier, one of the other things that I felt was quite significant was that more than 50% of respondents were concerned that systems, even once installed, were not maintained to a reliable standard, and that 30% of respondents even went as far as to say that they didn't necessarily feel safe in a building where voice alarm was installed because they had no faith that the system there would actually work in the event of an emergency. So I find that quite concerning.
Yeah, that's quite frightening to hear, isn't it, really? But maybe not completely surprising to you and I.
No, again, I think it bears out the experience that we all have.
So obviously, Neil, at some point there'll be a rather involved published article around this, and we just wanted to give the membership and anybody that's interested a taster. How would you summarise the findings that you expect us to publish?
Well, I think I'd like to, if I may, read a quotation from one respondent to the survey, and I felt that this was in a way sort of typical of many of the responses we've got. And that respondent said that the standards are not policed or enforced. The people responsible for enforcing them do not know that they should be enforcing them, nor is there any will to enforce. Most jobs are design and build, and as such they are down to the installer to justify his position to someone who wants the cheapest solution. All operate from a position of ignorance of the rules and requirements because nobody is interested in enforcing them, mainly due to economic pressures. Again, that's hardly a glowing endorsement of what we're achieving.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting as well about that is it shows that we have a real lobbying job to do. And unfortunately, that does fall to you. But of course, Neil, without the research that you and the committee have undertaken, we wouldn't have such a platform to launch that effort onto. So huge thanks for all of this work. And hopefully we can make an impact.
Yeah, I hope so. We'll go to it. I like having a set of data brought together from many countries and many professionals around the world. Makes it, I think, a much more powerful mission to go forward with proper data rather than a couple of opinions, however well founded they might be.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for everything you've done on behalf of the membership.
Great, thank you.